she was also living her dream. She loved her job, and despite being only 21 years old, she was a sixth grade teacher at Roarstown Elementary School in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And this wasn't just a job to Christy. It was her passion. She was devoted to her class, and the kids loved her in return. That first Christmas, well, actually before that first Christmas, Christy bought every child in the group a book. She carefully wrapped it and was planning on handing this out during his first period on Monday, December 21st, 1992. But as the first bell chimed that day, Christy was nowhere to be seen. Everyone was worried. In particular, the school's principal, Harry Goodman, who knew that Christy was not only a reliable person, but she was very punctual and would never be late without calling it in. Yet, she'd done just that, and now she wasn't even answering her phone. After a while, Principal Goodman decided to drive to Christie's apartment at the Greenfield Estates complex to check on her because he was genuinely worried. There he found the door standing slightly opened, but no answer when he knocked. He opened the door, calling her name. Then he stepped inside. And then he saw something that made him back out into the hallway. The blood drained from his face, his breathing labored, and a hand to his chest. He walked to a neighbor's door and knocked. The neighbor who answered thought that he was having a heart attack, but instead it was Christy. police who responded to the call found the once pretty blonde lying on the floor. She was fully dressed in her coat and gloves. Her skirt pushed up and her undergarments were lowered. The scene was brutal, but you could tell that the struggle before this now scene was hard to imagine. Christy had been beaten to death, so much so that it turned her face into basically blood. Her face was completely covered with it. She was barely recognizable. The weapon was lying beside her body. A wooden cutting block. Christmas presents were everywhere, and there was signs of struggle with everything out of order. But ultimately, she was not as strong as her killer, and the autopsy would later reveal that the young woman had been raped. It also indicated that she was strangled. Initially, police had two theories. The first was that Christy had known her killer and led him into the apartment. This made sense since there was no sign of forced entry, and Christy was always sure to lock her doors. The second theory is that she'd been ambushed as she was about to leave for work. Now, Christy had a roommate, Mary Lesko, who left the apartment just after 7 a.m. Christy usually left around 7:45 a.m. is a focused on principle good man who was still traumatized by the discovery of the body, but he was quickly eliminated from the suspect list. So then they switched their attention to a man that Christy had recently dated. A man who was not only dating her, but also married, and 20 years her senior. He was eliminated from that list too because his DNA did not match the fluids found at the crime scene. So now police were left with almost nothing but continued to interview and put those people through polygraphs, and there were dozens of suspects, but they were all ultimately cleared. However, early on the investigation, an eyewitness reports a man that was lurking around Christie's building on the day of the murder. His description was probably a man in his 20s with an athletic body, long, medium brown hair, clean shaved, with a deep set eyes. According to this witness, he'd driven up to the building in a mid-size white car, possibly a Dodge Yes or a Toyota. He parked his vehicle in the overflow parking lot across the street and walked to the entrance of Christie's building, and this was around 7 a.m. So the police publicly stated that this individual was a person of interest. However, they didn't have a name for that suspect, and the leads were just taking them away from the killer. However, they still developed a profile and described the suspect as a shy loner who kept to himself and probably would not stand out in a crowd. We then learn that this is the opposite of the man they were hunting. By the year 19 was ultimately eliminated by DNA. The suspect's DNA had also been submitted to the state database but had found no match there. Despite assurance by the police that the case had not been mothballed, the investigation was in trouble. There would be very little progress over the next 8 years. In the year 2003, there was an odd twist when a man called the Lancaster Sunday News and spoke to a reporter saying that he wanted to pitch a story idea. He suggested that the paper should run a piece about women who are secretly promiscuous and lead a double life that no one knows about. He named a few like Chandra Levy, the Washington, D.C. intern whose skeletal remains had been found in May of that year, and another one was Christy Mirack. They asked this man to elaborate, and he said that he knew about a barn on Christie's parents' property where she used to bring men for sex. He then said, "I'm not saying she deserved to die, but what did she expect?" The reporter passed on this information to the police, who then reached the FBI, and now a criminal profiler suggested that the caller was likely Christie's killer. Unfortunately, they couldn't trace the call, and the guy never called again. The police did check some things, like there was no barn on her parents' property. At this point, 14 years passed. DNA technology was way more advanced, and now they were able to process the same DNA to extract a profile from that biological material. And even if it was somehow degraded, it was still viable. Cold cases were being resolved up and down the country, but Christie's was not one of them. The Lancaster police continued to submit their profile to the Cody's database, but no match. In the year 2017, the police submitted their sample to a lab for DNA processing. The company had recently developed a technology that could create an identikit for the person based only on their DNA. The images they produced showed what the suspect would look like at age 25, 45, and 55. And they shared this with the media with the hope that somebody would recognize that person. Plenty of leads were generated, but none of them panned out. Now let's go back to the year 2010, when a company called GED Match was founded. The company's goal was to provide assistance to amateur and professional genealogists, giving them a tool to track down familial links. Someone wanting to use the platform simply needs to obtain their DNA profile via a company like 23andMe. They upload the profile onto GED Match and can view and compare their own information against the entire archive. Since the database is public, anyone can use it, including the police. In the year 2018, the profile was entered into this database and run against almost 1.5 million users, and it returned with a partial match. Police started to look into the background of the person they identified and found that he had a half-brother who had lived his entire life in Lancaster, but was never on the police's radar. Now this guy was a bit of a celebrity. He was a DJ who'd once been the resident disc spinner at a popular local night spot named Chameleon. He was also in high demand for weddings, proms, and stuff like that. His name investigators learn from a 1991 speeding ticket that he had a white Toyota, a vehicle that matched the one described by eyewitnesses. But if Raymond was the killer, then the murder was a one-off. Aside from a few traffic violations and a single arrest for disorderly conduct, his record was clean. When DJ Freeze played his next gig, undercover officers were in attendance, and when they saw him getting rid of a water bottle, they knew that was their chance. So they retrieved his chewing gum and a water bottle from the garbage, submitted it for testing, and finally delivered the news that investigators had been waiting to hear for 25 years. It was a match. Raymond Rowe was arrested and charged with Christie's murder on June 25th, 2018. In the recent years, he had become a born-again Christian, but he showed very little compassion at his trial. Christie's family was desperate for answers, but he refused to speak or say how she died. He refused to offer any relief. All he said was that he killed her and that he was sorry. And now it was left to the prosecution to speculate what might have happened in Christie's apartment that morning. Did they know each other? Lancaster is a small town with a limited after-hours scenes. Christy was a young woman who liked to go dancing with her friends, so they presumed they probably walked the same scene. We know that she knew him because or knew of him because of a pass from the club he would DJ at was found in her apartment. Did he spot her there? Was he rejected by her? Did he follow her home just to rape her? Did he kill her to stop her from talking? We will never know the answers to those questions. But she's gone.